Welcome back to the Wicked Psychology live hangout stream. Hopefully everyone had a great weekend. Today we are going to look at the Rachelle Waterman case. The overarching story is that she enlisted two of her ex-boyfriends to kill her mother. They tried to stage her death as a drunk driving accident, and when that didn't work, they burned the mother in her van. There are speculations for the motives, such as abuse, the mother not approving of her friends, and body shaming, among some others. So hopefully as we go through the case, light will be shined on the truth behind her motives for the crime. So it seems as though Rachelle didn't actually commit the murder herself, but rather sent her two exes to do her dirty work for her. Presumably they're already in jail, as we'll see later this week when we see some of their testimony. They're already in their orange jumpsuits, so presumably they had already had their trial before her trial. This trial is back from 2006, so bear with the footage here. And so we'll get started with the prosecution's opening statements.
Turning to Mr. West for opening statements.
This case is about Lauri Waterman, and this is a picture of Ms. Waterman. It was taken, it's actually one of the last pictures ever taken of it. It was taken on November 13th, 2004, at a Chamber of Commerce dinner in Craig. It was eaten that night, and 18 hours later, this is Lauri Waterman. She's dead and found in the burnt van about 18 hours later. Now, this case is about Lauri Waterman and her murder, and about the three people who planned and then murdered her. Those people were Brian Radel, Jason Arrant, and her daughter, Rachelle Waterman. Now, this conspiracy to kill her had its beginnings in the summer of 2004. During that time, Mr. Radel had a computer shop in Craig. During that summer, he ended up closing it in August of 2004. And several people hung out at the place. Jason Arrant, his friend, he's been a friend for a number of years. Rachelle Waterman, Mr. Radel had hired her to do some work for him. Mr. Arrant also did some work for him as well. Although Ms. Waterman didn't really actually do any work, she was hired to. And there was another individual, John Wilburn, he was a juvenile as well, and they all hung out together. And they didn't do a lot of work, but they did play a number of games. Particularly, they liked to play Dungeons and Dragons, so they spent a lot of time together that summer. Now, during that summer, Ms. Waterman began complaining to them about her mother, Lauri. Complained that Lauri Waterman was abusing her, that she was hitting her, threw her down some stairs, threatened her with a knife, and complained that she weighed too much and so wasn't feeding her. They tried to get her to report this to the police or social services, and she refused to do it, saying that they wouldn't believe her. So at that time, sometime in the summer, I think it was probably July or August, she was talking to Mr. Arrant, either in person or by chat on the email, or not email, but on the computer. And he asked her for his help. And Mr. Arrant says, well, what do you want me to do? And finally she says she wanted her mother dead. And so Mr. Arrant agreed to help her. He went and asked his friend, Mr. Radel, for it. Mr. Radel grew up on Prince of Wales, and his father had taught him survivor skills and military stuff as well. And he was a much bigger individual as well. And so Mr. Arrant asked Mr. Radel for some help, and asked him to help in planning and killing Ms. Lauri Waterman. Mr. Radel agreed. He said he'd do anything for Mr. Arrant and Ms. Waterman. Ms. Waterman and Mr. Radel had actually had a relationship earlier that summer, and it was a sexual relationship, but it had ended several months before this. Mr. Arrant and Ms. Waterman also had a sexual relationship afterwards, but it ended around August of 2004. But Mr. Radel agreed to do it. He believed it was necessary to protect Ms. Waterman, and he'd rather do that than go to police or social services. At that point, Mr. Radel pretty much took over what was going on. He was the one who came up with the plans, and he was going to be the one who did the killing and stuff. And Mr. Arrant took on the secondary role. His role was to have the ideas bounced off him by Mr. Radel. He also acted as a go-between between Ms. Waterman and Mr. Radel, since Ms. Waterman and Mr. Radel never talked directly about this. They always went through Mr. Arrant. Now, they came up with various plans on how they were going to do it over the several months from that summer, probably around August or so, that they started it, until November when they committed the crime. And they talked about several plans, Mr. Radel and Mr. Arrant and Mr. Arrant and Ms. Waterman. One of them was a boat tub plan in which they were planning on killing Lauri Waterman, putting her body into a tub, filling the tub with cement, taking it out on Mr. Radel's boat and just dropping it out into the water and let it sink, and she would disappear. Another one was Mr. Radel would simply break into the house and kill her, and no one would know, supposedly, who did it. Another one was Mr. Radel talked about blackmailing her, where they'd find out some damaging information about Lauri Waterman and threaten her with this information unless she left Rachelle alone. I also talked about a shooting plan in which Lauri Waterman would drive Rachelle to the high school in Craig, drop her off for volleyball practice, which would be in the late afternoon, and as she was driving out of the parking lot onto the street, she'd be stopped at a stop sign. Mr. Radel would be across the street hiding in the trees and would shoot right across the street into the front of the car and kill her at that point. The plan actually came fairly close. It got called off at the last minute. Mr. Arrant sent an email to Rachelle Waterman saying that the, quote, hunting trip, unquote, was off. And we've got the copy of the email. Here it is. This is the section we're dealing with. Here's the word hunting trip. And as you can see, it says, how does it go? Not much going on here today. I went down and found Brian so I could chat at him for a bit. Oh yeah, and we canceled that hunting trip we were planning for today, but he said he'd like to go sometime soon. No later than a week from now, we can swing it, so that would be fun. This is in September 29th. This was recovered from from the Waterman residence by the police. Mr. Arrant and when police talked with Ms. Waterman both stated that this was a reference to the shooting plot to kill her mother. The word hunting trip will also come up a little bit later in some other letters I'll show you. The actual plan that they worked out finally to kill Ms. Waterman is that Lauri Waterman was going to be home alone on the weekend of November 13th and 14th. Rachelle Waterman was going to be in Anchorage that weekend. She was on the high school volleyball team. They went to the state tournament up in Anchorage that weekend. She left Craig on Wednesday, November 10th. And she wasn't supposed to return until Sunday, November 14th. Doc Waterman, Carl Waterman, goes by Doc Waterman, was also going to be gone that weekend. He was up here in Juneau that weekend. He left Craig on Thursday, November 11th, and he was also going to return on Sunday, November 14th, at actually the same time as Rachelle Waterman was going to return. So that meant that Lauri Waterman was going to be home in Craig all by herself for the weekend. The plan was that Mr. Radel would break into the Waterman residence one of the evenings there, and then take her prisoner. He would force her to drink alcohol and get drunk, and then he would kill her by breaking her neck in some manner. And then he would place the body in the Waterman van, and they would take it out to a location and crash it. So it looked like she died in a DWI accident. That she was drunk, she crashed, and that's what broke her neck. And so it would hide what happened in this case, that it wasn't a murder, it was an accident. Now, the night of November 13th, Saturday night, Ms. Waterman, as I said, went to the Chamber of Commerce dinner in Craig. She went by herself. At the dinner, she won a jacket and left at about 10 o'clock p.m. that night. She left at the closing when a number of other people had finished cleaning up. She helped clean up, and then they all left about 10 o'clock that night, about 4 or 5 people there. And this is a picture I showed you earlier, Ms. Waterman at the dinner. Here she is also eating and stuff. And then, while she was doing that, Mr. Radel and Mr. Arrant were beginning preparations on that Saturday. They had to go out and get a few items that they needed. Mr. Radel already had some rope he was going to use. He found it along the roadside, and so he decided to use it. It was an old piece of rope. They purchased some items in Craig and Clark that Saturday afternoon that they were going to need that night. They purchased a hat, a stocking hat. They purchased some rubber gloves that Mr. Radel was going to wear so he wouldn't leave any fingerprints behind. They also got some duct tape, so he's going to wrap Lauri Waterman's hands around with it as bindings. He also bought some towels. He's going to put the towels on her arm. Then when he put the duct tape on, he wouldn't leave any adhesives on, so there wouldn't be any trace evidence of the adhesions on her arm. They got a wine bottle, a bottle of wine, so that he could force the alcohol in her and force her to get drunk. They also got some gasoline in case they needed it. They didn't know how much gasoline would be in the Waterman van, and they planned on driving. The location that they had picked was a long distance away. It's about an hour drive outside of Craig, so they brought along some gasoline as well. They also cut off Mr. Mr. Radel's hair. He had real long hair, a full beard and stuff, and they cut all of it off. So he wouldn't leave any trace evidence. He wouldn't leave any of his hair around in the residence when he broke in. Here's a picture of Mr. Radel. This was taken on the November 15th or November 17th, about 3.5 days later. As you can see, he's fairly bald. Police also recovered his hair. You can see quite a bit of the hair, how much they had to cut off to do it. Now, Mr. Arrant and Mr. Radel were at Mr. Radel's residence in Hollis, which is in Craig on the east coast of Prince of Wales Island. Craig's on the west coast. They were at that residence on Saturday night. They left the residence in Mr. Arrant's truck and drove to Craig. They left Hollis about midnight, got to Craig probably around 12:30. It's about a half-hour drive on that Saturday night. Actually, this would have been Sunday morning since it was after midnight. Mr. Arrant dropped off Mr. Radel at the boat harbor in Craig, which is about a couple blocks away from the Waterman residence. And he just let Mr. Radel off at that point. Mr. Arrant then drove to a gravel pit. It's just north of Cloac and waited there. He was going to wait a couple of hours until Mr. Radel came and met him in the Waterman van with Lauri Waterman. Meanwhile, Mr. Radel walked up to the Waterman residence. He broke into it. Here's a map of Prince of Wales Island. This is actually only the center part of the island. The island is actually fairly large. It's the third largest island in the United States. This is the center, approximately about the center third of the island. But here's Hollis, where Mr. Radel was living at, and here's Craig, so they had to drive across the island. Here's Cloac. It's about 8 miles north of Craig, maybe 10 miles. And then here's the gravel pit where Mr. Arrant waited for Mr. Radel. Here's a picture of that gravel pit. Now, this is the first floor of the Waterman residence. It's the ground floor. There's 3 floors on it. And this area is the garage. It's a 2-car garage. The large yellow area in it is where the van was parked at. They parked it at. Here's a downstairs bedroom. Here's where the family room and a bathroom was located. Here's where the front door was at. It's actually elevated a little bit. It's between the ground floor and the second floor or main floor of the residence. But here's the stairs. Now, Mr. Radel entered through an unlocked garage window over here on the side of the building. Here's the front of the house. You can see the front of it, and you can see where the 2-car garage is. And here's where he entered at, the side of the garage. There's a window up near the front part of the garage. He went in through here. The police later discovered a footprint, which has consistencies with the boot that belonged to Mr. Radel. Here's the inside of the garage, and here's the window where he entered into. He got in and he went up to the door from the garage into the main part of the house, and it was locked. So there's a little pet door on it. He reached in and reached up around and was able to then unlock the door and get in that way. Now, here's the door from the garage into the main part of the house, and here's the pet door. Here's the other side of the door. Here's the pet door right here that he reached through, and actually you can see very well, but this is where the doorknob is. The police had removed it. They checked to see if there were any fingerprints on it. And he reached up, and that's how he was able to get in, was unlock the door and come in that way. This is the second floor, this is the ground floor still. He went in, he checked the downstairs. He'd only been to the residence once, and he had only come into the to the front door, so he hadn't been into the rest of the house. So he checked the downstairs, nobody was there. He then went up to the second floor. This is the second floor of the residence, and this is where Waterman's bedroom was at. Here's where another bedroom was located. Here's where a computer room was at, and here's where the kitchen was at, and here's the living room. Now he checked the second floor, or here's the stairs as well. He checked the second floor, there wasn't anybody there, so then he went up the stairs to the third floor. This is the top floor. Consists of basically 2 rooms and the bathroom. Here's the stairs, he came up. Here's where an exercise room is located at, and there's a bathroom in the area, and here's where the master bedroom is located at. This is where Lauri Waterman was at when he came to the residence. Now he came up the stairs here. When he did, Lauri Waterman was actually awake, and when he came up the stairs, she got up off the bed and went and closed the door. Apparently she didn't see him or anything, but she came up and closed the door, and Mr. Radel went in, hid in the exercise room. He waited there for over an hour, approximately an hour, or a little over an hour, for Lauri Waterman to get to sleep. Here's the master bedroom, and here's the exercise room where he waited for about an hour. Now, after she was asleep and he waited for about an hour, he then went into the bedroom, snuck into the bedroom, and then jumped on top of Lauri Waterman. She struggled for a short time, 5 minutes or so, and then finally she stopped struggling. When she did that, he then got her up, put restraints on her. He then had to remove them so that she could get dressed because she was in a nightgown. Then she put clothes on her. He put the restraints, he put the towels around her first and then put the duct tape on her. He then tied a rope on her arms as well to help hold her and direct and tell her where to go. Sometime during this struggle, he was wearing, as I told you, he got rubber gloves, and during the time he was in there, he wore rubber gloves. Sometime while he was in the bedroom there, struggling with her for a short time, and then putting the ropes and binding stuff on it, the tip of the rubber glove got torn off. And he looked for it, and he couldn't find it in the bedroom, so he left. He then took Ms. Lauri Waterman down to the kitchen. There was actually a open bottle of wine in there, and he forced her to drink the bottle of wine, so he didn't have to use the one that he had brought in himself. And he left that empty bottle of wine then in the residence, and it was found there, although it had been thrown out by the time the police ended up checking the place several days later. He forced her to drink the alcohol and got her drunk. He then put her in the van. He tied her up in the van. It was between the front seat and the middle row of the van. He put her on the floor, tied her down there. And then he drove out. He opened the garage door, drove out, and then closed the garage door, and then drove away. He then drove up to north of Cloak, where he met Mr. Arrant. Mr. Arrant was actually driving back towards town to see if he could see what was going on or find out anything. And he passed the van as it was coming in. He recognized the van. It was like a dark purple. It was fairly noticeable, the van. And he then turned around and then followed Mr. Radel. They then drove to the site where they had planned on killing her and setting up the van to crash in. And Mr. Arrant followed the van all the way up there. The site was about an hour north of Craig, so it's a fairly long drive. And the plan, as I said, was to drive the van off the embankment, off the side of the road after they had killed her and put her body in, so it looked like a DWI accident. Now, here's the map I've shown you earlier. Here's Craig. Here's Cloak. Here's where the gravel pit where Mr. Arrant was waiting. And here's the location where Lauri Waterman was killed. It's a long drive. It was almost an hour. It's up near a small community called Nockady. It's just about a couple miles outside of the community. There's only a few. There's not very many people that are there. Less than 100 people. But that's the site that they had chosen. Here's a picture of it. It's just before you get to the bridge. This is the side of the road. This is where they pulled off, and this is where he actually killed her at. Here's the view turning 180 degrees and looking back, standing with the back towards the bridge. Here's the area where they were planning on killing her. And you can see where the trooper car is parked up at the top of the road. This is the embankment where they intended to drive the van off the side of the road there and crash it after they had put her body in it. Excuse me. Now, Mr. Radel, as I stated, I showed you in the picture, he stopped the van at the side of the road there, and Mr. Arrant, I think, pulled in and stopped behind him. Mr. Radel put a large plastic garbage bag on the ground so that Lauri Waterman wouldn't get dirty, so it wouldn't look suspicious if she was all dirty when they put her back in the van. It was also rainy and kind of windy that night too. Mr. Radel then pulled Lauri Waterman from the van. He put her on the bag. He had her in a kneeling position. She was real drunk at this time. He said she really didn't say much. He then tried to break her neck like you've seen on TV. He first tried to have her pull her head back and forth real hard to like a whiplashing. That didn't work. He then tried to literally twist her head all the way around. He got pretty far around, but he still wasn't able to break her neck. He then used a small red flashlight that Mr. Arrant had in his truck. It wasn't like the usual one you see. It was kind of a squarish one. I'll show you a picture later. Mr. Radel got that and then started pounding her in the throat with it. He hit her at least a dozen times in the throat with her, trying to break her throat that way. And that still didn't kill her. He then put his hands on her, over her mouth and her nose, and held it on there probably for about 5 minutes. Ended up actually suffocating her, and then that actually ended up killing her. That stopped her from breathing. So it took a while for them to actually kill her. They then had to dispose of the body. As I said, they were going to try to use the DWI plan, but they weren't able to do it at this time. While they were doing all this, killing her, trying to kill her and doing this stuff, she ended up falling off of the plastic bag and getting a lot of mud all over her clothes. So they figured that plan wouldn't work because they'd see when they find the body, they'd find dirt and mud all over it. Her throat was also pretty badly damaged from being hit with the flashlight. So they decided that they needed to change the plan at that point. They couldn't go through with the DWI plan anymore. They then their plan was that they had been out at another area on Prince of Wales Island. It's called U.S. Forest Service Road 3012. It's an old logging road. It's open, but it's not maintained. People who generally go back in there are hunters, and it's a fairly isolated area. They had been up there in the past, and they decided that would be a good spot to get rid of the van and Ms. Waterman, and they planned on at that point just to set it on fire and burn everything up. Now, they put the body, Mr. Radel and Mr. Arrant picked the body up and put it back in the van in the same area where he had originally tied her, which was between the front seat and the middle row on the floor. And he put her body in the van there. Mr. Radel then drove the van. Mr. Arrant followed in the truck, and they drove to Road 3012. Now, here's, again, the map I've shown you. Here's the site where they killed her. Here's where they actually brought the van to. In this area here is where U.S. Forest Service Road 3012 is. It's just before you get to Thorn Bay. The main road goes to Thorn Bay, and this is one of the logging roads that come off of the main road there. So they went to that location. And when they got there, it was a difficult drive because it's a real steep climb up there. And he parked on an incline up at the top with the front pointed downward, and put a rock there. And the plan was to set the van on fire and then push it down the side of the hillside there. When they did, they rolled out the front windows, they rolled them down. The hatch back, they opened the back up so it would be opened up and ventilated. He then put a number of items in the van. He put the keys to the van, he left them in the ignition. He put the bottle of wine that they had bought, which they didn't use, put that in the van too. He then poured gasoline inside the van on her body and inside the van. And then, just as they were getting ready to start it, suddenly the van just rolled down the hill before he got it started. Mr. Radel then set fire to the van. He tried pouring some gas to put a gas trail up to the top of the hill and lighting it, and it didn't work, probably because it was too wet. It was, as I said, rainy and kind of stormy that night. So he got a bunch of paper towels and he lit them and then threw them in the back of the open hatch of the van, and the van caught fire that way. And then the two of them drove away in Mr. Arrant's truck. Now, this is an aerial view that was taken of the scene. The person at the crime lab drew the lines around it so you could see the area of the logging road. They go up to two log gathering sites nearby. Here you can see where our trooper car is located. There's a turnout there. Here's where a bunch of logs are still located at, and here's where the van is located. As you can see, it's off the road. It's down the side of a hillside. Here's the road going up to it, and you can see it's fairly steep area going up to it. And here's the van that was as it was recovered. And as you can see, it went down the hillside there. You can see part of the logging road, it doubles back. And that's how you get up to it, is through that road there. Now, they also had some other evidence that they wanted to get rid of. And so they drove to a location near Hollis. It's just off the Harris River. Harris River goes right by Hollis. And they drove to that location. And they burned some of the items that Mr. Radel had used. He had the cap he didn't burn. It's a mistake, but he burnt the rope. There was some duct tape, the towels, and the rubber gloves. He all put into a fire. I think they put some gas on it, and they set it on fire. The two of them drove back to Mr. Radel's residence in Hollis, and Mr. Arrant then drove home to Klawock. Now, here's the map I've shown you. Here's the site where the van was burnt. Here's Hollis, and the site is just where they burnt the items were located outside of the town. Now, we know about all these sites because Mr. Arrant took the police to all of them afterwards and showed them where all these sites were. Here's the site where they burnt the stuff at. Here's the burnt items that the troopers recovered. And here's the items, close-up of the items that were there that were recovered. Now, Road 3012 is an isolated area, but it's actually a fairly popular hunting area. And so that morning, Sunday morning, there were several hunters in the area. Must have been 4 or 5 hunters in the area, but one of them was Scott McDonald, and he was up there hunting in the area, and he saw some smoke coming from a van up in that area. So he went and checked, and he went in and he saw the body in there, the burnt body of Lauri Waterman. At that time, he didn't know who the van was. You could tell from the picture I showed earlier that it's impossible to even tell what the color of the van was. You could tell it was a van, but you couldn't tell anything more about it. So he went up and he saw the van, and he saw the body in the back of the van there, between the front seat and the middle seat. So he then went and contacted the troopers. Actually, what he did is he went to a location where his cell phone works, and he calls his mother, who's in Thorn Bay. Thorn Bay is right outside, not too far away. His mother actually handles emergency responses in the Thorn Bay area. So he called her, and she called the troopers, and the troopers were notified about it, and reporting that Scott had found this burnt van and a body in it. 2 troopers, Trooper Claus and Trooper Taylor, went out to that road area. And when they went out to the main road, met Scott McDonald, and Scott McDonald drove them up, and they went up to the location where the van was at. And then Trooper Claus saw the burnt and dead body in the back of the van. Here's, as I've shown you, the body. Now, Trooper Claus believed it was pretty suspicious looking. The body was not located in the driver's seat. It was located in the back area, which indicated that somebody put her there and then set it on fire. And so he believed that there was a suspicious fire. So he called for some help. He's just a local trooper, and so he called for help on handling what could be an arson, a murder, or something of that nature. But it was a suspicious circumstance, so he asked for some help. He also couldn't identify the van at that time. He looked for the license plate. The fire was so hot that it melted both license plates. He looked for the VIN number, but the dash area had been so melted that it was just a bunch of mess stuff, and he didn't want to dig through it to see it located the VIN, so he didn't know who the van belonged to or who the body was at that point. So he contacted some help. Investigators were contacted that Sunday and were asked to come down to Prince of Wales to handle the investigation. The Alaska State Troopers Bureau of Investigation, Sergeant Randy McFerrin's there, was put in charge of it. He handles homicide investigations, and so he was put in charge of it. Crime lab individual Dale Bivens, he does crime scene investigations. He also does fingerprint analysis. They also sent a Deputy Fire Marshal, John Bond, down because there was a burnt van and there's a dead body in it, so they also brought an arson investigator down. The investigators flew from Anchorage that Sunday night. They overnighted here in Juneau on Sunday night and then flew down Monday morning to the scene there. And basically nothing happened for the rest of that until Monday, actually around noon on Monday. The site there was just cordoned off, people were kept away, and nothing else was done to investigate it that night. Now, meanwhile, Doc Waterman and Rachelle Waterman returned to Craig on Sunday. Rachelle Waterman flew from Anchorage, where she was with the volleyball tournament. She left from Anchorage and then flew to Ketchikan. Doc Waterman got on the same flight when it stopped here in Juneau, and so the two of them were on the same flight. They then, while he was in Juneau and then coming home, he called home several times to let Lauri Waterman know that he was coming home. There was no answer. He left a couple of messages on the answering machine. Once they got to Ketchikan, they flew from Ketchikan to Hollis on float planes. Actually, they flew on separate float planes, but they flew to the Hollis together on the float planes. And from there, Doc Waterman drove Rachelle Waterman back to Craig. They arrived sometime that Sunday afternoon. When they got there, Lauri Waterman and her van weren't there. Doc Waterman didn't think anything of it right then, but after several hours, she didn't show. And so he got concerned. He went in around and drove around for a little bit, couldn't find the van. That evening, he called the Craig Police, and it was about 9 o'clock that night. He called the Craig Police Department and reported that the Lauri was missing and the van was missing. The police then contacted Trooper Claus, and told him that Lauri Waterman and the van were missing. And this was probably about 10 o'clock that night, and so Trooper Claus suspected this might be Lauri Waterman. So the next morning, it said Monday morning, the investigators flew from Juneau. They flew to Ketchikan. They took a float plane over to the area. They actually flew over the area and took some photographs of the area. You saw one of their photographs earlier. And then they flew into Thorn Bay, and they were driven from Thorn Bay up to the site where the van was at. The body and the debris around the body were removed, placed in a body bag, and that was sent to the medical examiner's office in Anchorage for an examination. The van was towed from the scene. After they did most of the investigations, they towed it away and took it into the DOT, Department of Transportation garage in Quad. They did get some other items at the location. They found a lot of items they found. Most of them didn't have any significance, but they did find a few items. They found what appeared to be a gas trail coming up to the top of the hill from the van. And they seized several items like some plants and rocks of the area to check to see if there was gas. They found in the van a melted bottle, like a wine bottle. They found the keys were in there. They also found that the windows had been rolled down and that the back window on the hatch had been left up. They were able to determine all of this by looking at the van. They did locate the VIN number. It was in a bunch of the materials down where the dash had been at, and they checked the VIN number, and it was the Waterman vehicle. It was the Waterman vehicle VIN number. So at that point, they knew it was the Waterman vehicle, and they figured it was Lauri Waterman's body at that point. But they didn't have a positive ID. Positive ID on the body was done by a forensic dentist. They got dental records from her dentist in Craig, sent them up, and a forensic dentist with the medical examiner's office examined the teeth remains against Lauri Waterman's dental records, and they matched, so it was Ms. Waterman's body. Here's the van, a closer up view of the van. Here's the top. I'm going to show you on the top up there. You can see glass, and that's how they were able to determine that the hatch window was open, because the van was at an angle, the fire was hot, and the glass just blew forward on it. The arson person will talk to you about that. Inside, you can see everything was melted virtually except for the metal stuff, like the metal frames of the seat. You look at the back through the van, so you can see it was a very, very hot fire. And the fire was started and was mostly contained on the inside of the van, indicating that gasoline or an accelerant was poured inside the van, and started on the inside. In other words, it didn't start with the engine or on the outside of the van. It was started inside the body of the van, inside. Here's where the fire was so hot it blew part of the hatch, the pistons on the part of the hatch that holds it up. Here's the key you can see that was in the ignition. Here's the part of the wine bottle. There's a few other items that were recovered. Now, once they determined that it was the Waterman van, and they then focused on the Waterman residence. They found out that it was a Waterman van early afternoon on Monday. The troopers contacted Chief C and let him know that the van had been identified as a Waterman van, and that the body was probably Lauri Waterman's body. Chief C then went to the Waterman residence. He's the one who contacted Doc Waterman, told him about the information about the van being found and that Lauri Waterman was probably the body that was found inside it. When he was there, Doc Waterman told him that he found some suspicious items in the bedroom. They were the tip of a rubber glove, and there was some of this strange fiber that he found inside the residence, and he showed him to Chief C. Chief C immediately figured that this had something to do with Lauri Waterman's disappearance. He asked Doc Waterman and Rachelle Waterman to leave the residence so that they could do some investigations. They did, and the house was then kept. Nobody else was allowed in except for the police to do investigations for the next 2 days. Doc Waterman and Rachelle Waterman moved next door to the Pierces and stayed there. Chief C then told the troopers about the things he found in it, and as I said, the police guarded the place while the scene was investigated later that night and the next day. Now, the people that did the investigations at the house were Sergeant McFerrin, Craig Police Officer Sergeant Mark Habib, Chief Jim C., and Dale Bivens from the Crime Lab. They went and examined the house. They recovered a number of items. They recovered a rubber glove tip. They recovered numerous fibers, like from a rope, in several locations. The upstairs bedroom had a number of them on the floor. There was one found on the stairs going down, and a number of them were found at the doorway where the door goes into the garage area. They found a number of them there. They also found clothes that Lauri Waterman had worn to the Chamber of Commerce dinner. They had seen the pictures we had seen. The police had gotten those, so they knew what clothes she was wearing. They wanted to see if she had gotten home that night, and the clothes showed that since they were in there, they were hung up in the bedroom and stuff. There was a program from the dinner as well, and in the jacket she'd worn at the dinner, they had all recovered from the residence, which showed she got home that night and when she left there at about 10 o'clock. Now here you can see the glove tip that was recovered, and here you can see the fiber that Doc Waterman recovered. He put them on these mirrors here, this mirror. The ruler was the investigators put that on it to give you a scale. Now, these items here, the police put these pieces of white paper under the fibers where they found them, so they would see where they were at, and it would also stand out. And you can see a number of them were found by the bed from like an old rope. It actually turned out to be that the rope Mr. Radel got and used was old, and it shed some of the fibers off of it, so that's what these were from. Here's one of the fibers you can see in this picture. Here's the garage door. You can see where the pet door was at. This is in the garage. The little arrows show where some of the fibers were located. Now, they also found a footprint in the garage window. After they had ended up interviewing Mr. Radel and told him how he got in and stuff, they went and looked at the house again, and Sergeant Habib looked at the window, and he found a footprint on the window. He also found on the ground outside the window a spark plug box. It didn't look like it had been there very long. And on the inside of the window, on top of a metal case by the window, there were several other the same type of box of spark plugs up there. Here's the window. Here's where the spark plug is. You can see it down there where the red is at. Here's the close-up of it. And inside you can see a couple of the spark plug boxes there, the yellow ones on the right side. Now, Trooper Claus began to suspect fairly early on, Monday or so, that Mr. Arrant and Mr. Radel may have had something to do with killing Lauri Waterman. Now, once the van was identified as Lauri Waterman's van, which was Monday afternoon. Now, Trooper Claus has been living in Prince of Wales Island for about 12 years. He knows the Waterman family fairly well. He knew Lauri Waterman and Doc Waterman. He has two daughters. They're about the same age as Rachelle Waterman. Rachelle had been over to his house. His daughters had been over to her house. They were friends. In fact, his daughter had dated Rachelle Waterman's older brother, Jeffrey, at one time. So he knew the family real well. And he knew that there was friction in the family because of Jason Arrant, that Rachelle had dated Jason earlier that year when she was 15 and then turned 16. She turned 16, I think it was in August that year. And Mr. Arrant was 24 years old. Lauri Waterman didn't want to have them dating, and this had caused friction between Lauri Waterman and Rachelle Waterman. And so Trooper Claus at that point began as a possible suspect, Mr. Arrant. And he knew that Mr. Arrant probably wouldn't have been able to do this, his personality, but he did know that Mr. Radel was Mr. Arrant's best friend, and he would do virtually anything for Mr. Arrant, and he thought Mr. Radel would be capable of killing someone. So he had these suspicions in his mind. In addition, when the police began contacting these people and they saw Mr. Radel, they saw all of his hair shaved off. I mean, he stood out like a sore thumb at that point with all of his hair gone. He'd always been running around with this real long hair and beard, and then suddenly it's all shaved off. So the police began fairly early on, Monday, Tuesday, particularly when they saw Mr. Radel on Tuesday, that these people were probably involved in this. The police interviewed Mr. Arrant and Mr. Radel several times beginning Tuesday, November 5th or 16th, all the way until Friday, November 19th. They initially denied having any involvement or any knowledge of what happened with Lauri Waterman. On Wednesday it was, the police got called to the Cloak Police Department, the troopers did, because there was a report of an assault. It was Wednesday about 5 p.m. That someone had attacked Mr. Arrant at the Cloak School. Sergeant McFerrin and Trooper Claus responded to it. Mr. Arrant had a scratch on his neck from one side to the other side, and he claimed that some masked man had put a knife to his throat, rubbed it on his throat, threatening him, saying, quote, "Stay away from Rachelle or another accident will happen," unquote. Now, the troopers didn't believe it. They thought that he had faked it to throw suspicion off of it, and in fact, that's what happened. He did fake it to throw suspicion off him. Mr. Arrant later told them. But they didn't believe it. They checked the area out. They found nothing. Checked people in the area. Nobody saw anything. It was clear to them that this was a fake. And that only heightened their suspicion about Mr. Arrant and Mr. Radel. Now, on Thursday, November 18th, the police were interviewing Mr. Arrant. He initially denied knowing anything, and then suddenly he told the police that Mr. Radel had killed Lauri Waterman. He didn't give him the whole story. He altered it some. He said that Mr. Radel had asked him to meet him at a location. He then went to the location and met Mr. Radel, who was driving Ms. Waterman's van. Lauri Waterman was in it, was already dead. And they drove to the site where Mr. Radel burnt the van and Lauri's body, and he had no involvement. He agreed to wear a wire and talk with Mr. Radel, and he did. That same day, they got a warrant to allow him to do this. They put a wire on Mr. Arrant. The two of them, Mr. Arrant drove out to Hollis, contacted Mr. Radel. They got into Mr. Arrant's truck and they drove around. And Mr. Radel made some admissions about his involvement in her death, and he also implicated Mr. Arrant in this conversation. Mr. Radel was arrested that same day. That evening was on a warrant. He then talked to the police that day, and the same day fully confessed to killing her, confessed about what he did to get in, and the whole description I've given is what he described to the police. Mr. Arrant was arrested the next day, Friday morning. He also talked with the police. He also fully confessed about what happened. He also showed him the sites where the sites where I showed you at. He showed them all of them, taking them out there, and where the evidence was at, where Lauri Waterman had been killed.